During the Battle of Waco, various contributing factors determined often the lengths of the various engagements occurring throughout the battlefield, as every sort of combat element had clashed seemingly with one another throughout the battle space, as both the PLA and American Army forces faced off against one another, with the PLA possessing overwhelming capabilities in terms of not only their ISR network, with everything from their quadcopter local level squad-based reconnaissance assets all the way up to the macro level high altitude drones, such as, for example, the WZ-7s or the CH-4As, which were armed high-altitude reconnaissance drones. There was also the stealth WZ-8 and more, as these formed an even higher altitude level of ISR capabilities, followed at the highest level by military satellites. As the Americans had lost their own ISR networks, they had put up their best resistance possible, as many of these defending forces had sought to connect with one another to attempt to be able to stiffen their defenses and put up some manner of a defensive line. As this was possible indeed in some places, in certain other places it just was not. However, within the Waco battle space, there would be holdouts in the downtown that would indeed use their resources to their best advantage, which included even their armored engineering vehicles, their M1150s, similar in many respects to the Chinese GCZ-112, with its bulldozer and earth mover, as well as its rocket line charge for clearing obstacles, minefields, and even working against enemy personnel and vehicles and other obstacles, as these CHICOM forces were likewise busy clearing the battlefield of their opponents, as the combat engineering forces in the previous two installments of this subseries of the Hypothetical Invasion documentary series utilizing fourth-generation warfare doctrines had shown, the Combat Engineering Battalion of the 38th PLA Infantry Brigade, as well as the 8th Independent PLA Brigade, had both undertaken different operations to remove mixed American military personnel as well as armed reactionary civilians in various engagements, as at the battle that had occurred in the south-central portion of Waco, in the Hewitt area, also relatively close to the kill box that had been conducted by a mechanized infantry battalion from the 38th Infantry Brigade, as well as the artillery forces assisting heavily in that operation. They had likewise assisted in heavily shelling American reactionary armed civilians, as well as mixed American forces that had gathered in this particular area, on making a desperate attempt to move north and link up with the 143rd Infantry Regiment, whom they knew was defending the area as had been previously assigned, as they were to move from the downtown staging area to the Waco Regional Airport and occupy and defend it, as the nation was just starting to gear up in response to the Sino-Russian naval drills occurring off of both coasts, as well as heightened international tensions, especially with China and many of their allies. As such was the case, they were likewise also to send a force to the TSTC airport, which was likewise very important, especially to the American defense contractors that operated in the area. L3 and SpaceX and General Dynamics just being three, as well as others. As the mixed American military forces, in addition to those that had been destroyed by the other elements of the 38th Infantry Brigade, the Mechanized Infantry Forces and Combat Engineers. Their other Mechanized Infantry Battalion operating in the Southwest Quadrant would be facing off against an even larger element of mixed American Army forces from Fort Hood, having fled from the Chinese and Russian assault on the installation. It was a brutally vicious assault, and it came as a total surprise. And the only saving grace for these forces was the fact that they were all conducting live fire training at the time of the invasion, with only 1/4 of the entire personnel of the installation doing this training, as well as interoperability training on many levels, with the rest of the forces on the main post partying and drinking, as was the normal case for many evenings. And as a result, they were caught completely with their proverbial pants down, as the Redcon status for Fort Hood had not been raised to the same level as it had been for Fort Bliss, and even Fort Sill had a higher Redcon status than even Fort Hood had. And as a result, when the attack came, very few forces managed to flee the installation before they could be physically reached by the Russian and/or Chinese forces that were attacking the installation, as the 15th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade was moving in through the north, and they were very close to cutting off all of these forces. However, as they fled the installation, artillery strikes and harassment from the PLAAF in the form of their J-11 fighters, as well as their accompanying FH-97A stealth fighter drones, had harried them and harassed them with strafing attacks, along with the artillery strikes and also loitering munitions in the form of Russian Lancet 3s and Chinese CH-901As. As they had fled into the Waco battle space, out of one and into another, they had been assaulted by the PLA units in the form of these battalions moving in to block their escape, essentially trapping them within a strategic trap, being the entire Waco battle space, as they were now locked into the city from all sides and could not escape their fate. However, as the first grouping of several companies had clashed with this Mechanized Infantry Battalion of PLA forces from the 38th Infantry Brigade, they had rushed and linked up with other forces fleeing the area who had earlier witnessed the kill box occurring and had fled, and had also been fired upon previously by one of the 5 Wing Loon 2 armed combat drones, causing them to flee into the city, linking up with these forces that earlier clashed with this battalion, before the battalion had pursued them, with this other grouping linking up with them as well, with this group returning as these forces had made contact with them across the highway by sending a messenger and warning them of what had occurred, as they had already been assaulted by a PLA Mechanized Infantry Battalion, as well as witnessed a kill box that had occurred over there as it pertained to this grouping here. As they had fled into this area by 2:30 a.m., or 30 minutes after this battle had finished, essentially, as it essentially was a 20-minute long engagement, and 10 minutes later this battle was occurring, so it would be 30 minutes after 2 a.m. This battle was unfolding as the Mechanized Infantry forces had raced into south central Waco and were about to engage them, as 2 different companies were assaulting straight up the middle of these mixed forces, which included the rest of the 2 mixed heavy companies, minus 4 tanks that were within this group here that had actually made it into downtown, as the armored forces became broken up into 2 main groups, with this group having many of the forces of the previous 2 heavy companies within 49 Cav, as well as this grouping here, which included all these company-sized elements of 2 to 3 companies each coming together to reconstitute almost a full battalion in strength, with the last 4 tanks that had become separated from all these other forces and were part of this mixed American unit here that had made it into the downtown area. with the rest of these forces consisting of other elements of the 91st Brigade Engineering Battalion that had mixed in with these other forces, elements of 2-3 ACR, which was a striker-oriented element, as well as elements of the 4-9 Cavs rifle companies, and also even elements from the 3rd Brigade of 1st Cav, the 2 companies that were doing interoperability training on Fort Hood that had fled at the first sign of trouble with the others. As these forces all mixed together in this particular battle, they would be shelled heavily, everything from terrain denial strikes to precision strikes, as well as the fire support company that was part of the regular mechanized infantry battalion, as opposed to the light mechanized infantry forces that had an anti-tank company of wheeled WZ 5550s. This regular mechanized infantry battalion came with the standard fire support company, which included a platoon of PLL-05 120 millimeter assault gun / mortars. It was a dual purpose weapon that could be used as a heavy mortar or direct assault weapon, as well as the 130 millimeter short range light artillery multiple launch rocket systems, which were the Type 63 MLRS systems, which were short range and light artillery systems. And there were 2 platoons of those in the fire support company, as well as its headquarters platoon. As they all advanced against these forces, moving up through the middle were 2 companies who brought forward a platoon from their fire support company, which was the dual assault gun / mortar platoon. As these forces on the map are moving into an area adjacent to the ring road, or the 340/6 highway, which was right here with the street bridges across it, and also an exit ramp here and an exit ramp here for the traffic on this side. In this particular area, there was a shopping plaza with a grocery store in the middle, as well as small shops on this side and small shops on this side. And there were grassy abutments, curbs, that ringed this entire facility, this whole area right here. As this area, again, consisted of shops, a grocery store, more shops that bent like this, and a few shops on the end, and this large parking lot. And it was next to a wide boulevard. It was a multi-lane boulevard that went through this area and passed by some housing neighborhoods, as well as apartments. This being an apartment complex, these being some more small shops, this being a store, like a furniture store, this being a gas station, these being houses with a wall that separated this street from this street that ran past these homes right here. There was another wall and a street right here and a street right here. And these were fencing that separated the backyards and also the main street from the side street that contained these homes. Also continued up here, as well as this street stopping here but going around here, as there were houses right here with a street off the map. As these mixed American forces had moved into the area, again, there was almost a full armored company's worth of tanks here from the 2 mixed heavy companies, which had all moved into place as on the map, as they had all rendezvoused together in this particular area, with this one moving back down to give them assistance and fending off the approaching Chi-Com forces whom they knew would come after them. These forces would end up trying to retreat after being assaulted heavily by these mechanized infantry forces. This map is only a segment of this larger battle occurring between the whole battalion and all of the mixed American forces, which ended up constituting a battalion of mixed forces, everything from engineers to armor to striker-based forces to mechanized infantry rifle company type forces, all mixed together. As this only shows 2 PLA mechanized infantry companies which there was a company here and a company here, which all had dismounted troops. This was the assault gun mortar platoon of the PLL-05s, all 5 of them right here, that had been called up away from their previous position of the fire support company, who had by this point also set up their Type 63 short-range light artillery multiple launch rocket systems, which would also partake in the fighting in this particular battle, as well as artillery strikes that had been called in from the artillery battalion of the PLL 66 152 millimeter howitzers to be fired in support of the mechanized infantry forces operating in the area. Also would be fired a salvo of loitering munitions in the form of CH-901As. 2 cruise missiles would be passing overhead, going for their targets within the local area that will be off map, as well as a Wing Loom 2 and one of the high-altitude, heavily armed CH-4A drones, recon drones, armed recon drones that carried 4 extra air-to-ground munitions than even did the Wing Loom 2, which was specifically made as a combat drone. So there would be air support from these drones, from the CH-4A firing its air-to-ground CM-502 KGs and HJ-10 anti-tank missiles, with the CH-901A loitering munitions set to AI targeting parameters and equipped with their heat warheads, their high explosive anti-tank warheads. As in the image here, these are CH-901As moving in for the proverbial kill and literal kill. And this is a quadcopter reconnaissance asset, as each vehicle and dismounted squad that belonged to each vehicle possessed a single quadcopter recon drone, as every crew and vehicle together possessed a single drone, which a constellation of them mapped out the battlefield in real time. Another one here, operated by this squad of troops, half squad here, another 5 half squad here. They're already taken out an Abrams tank with an HJ-08 man-portable anti-tank missile system, such as this soldier back here is firing at this M1A2 main battle tank, which is trying to fight back as best as it can. This soldier here is firing a Type 69 Chinese RPG. With the American soldiers firing their M16A4s or M4 carbines. They had their M249 squad automatic weapons as their light squad machine guns, when the Chinese had their QJB-201s, which were also a high rate of fire light machine gun at the squad level. This is a missile fired from a combat drone like a Wing Loom 2, coming in also to hit the tank. As these forces of mechanized infantry were equipped with the Type 89A armor personnel carrier, which carried their infantry squads into battle, as well as also the ZBD-04A, these forces were a very potent strike force, especially with the loitering munition support and armed drone support from both the high-altitude CH-4A as well as the Wing Loom 2, firing their air-to-ground missiles as well as the loitering munitions and artillery support, and also support from their dual assault gun mortars and light artillery multiple launch rockets, which would hit up in the north just off this map. As one company would cover one side of this operation on just this one map segment, as the whole battalion of the Mechanized Infantry Battalion consisted of 6 mechanized infantry companies, 1 fire support company, and 1 headquarters and support company with the command and logistical elements of the whole battalion. This is just 2 companies, 2 mechanized infantry companies, moving up the center of this attack right here with the other companies on the other side, 2 on each side of these 2 here, with the fire support company backing all of them up. The other 2 companies on each side handling the flanks of the operation. Although the PLA lost a few vehicles at the opening, as an M1A2 tank had moved into place and fired and destroyed this Type 89A armor personnel carrier with the ZBD-04 right behind it with its IR and laser scrambling, making it exceedingly difficult to hit with the laser range finder on the armor. It had returned fire with one of its HJ-09 anti-tank missiles and destroyed it right off the bat. As these dismounted troops were already taking fire from American soldiers on the roofs of these one-floor shops, they were returning fire in their rolling T formations, a tactical formation designed with being able to watch the ground level but also upper levels at the same time, as there were 3-point men at the front with 1 on each side watching up each side of streets or buildings they were passing by. As these forces proceeded towards this grouping of shops, 1 squad went inside and begun to clear this, with another squad clearing this and another clearing this, with this formation, this wedge formation, moving up beside the buildings in a line formation as it moved alongside the buildings before holding their position while these buildings were being cleared, with this rolling T moving up on the side, holding their position as well, as they were now taking fire from a Striker infantry carrier vehicle with its turret machine gunner, and also a double column rolling shield formation of troops behind it and the building as they would pop out every so often and fire, plus troops and vehicles up here. There was a M113 mortar track with an 81 millimeter mortar, which ended up firing against the PLA forces and hit beside this building right here. As they had no ISR capabilities, they had to walk in their mortars, but they would not have much time to do so. However, they would get a lucky hit elsewhere as an American mortar fired from this mortar track right here, got in a good strike and wounded a few soldiers and KIA'd 7 more. 7 were KIA'd by this strike right here, although this strike did absolutely nothing. However, the loitering munitions moving into the area would destroy this vehicle, this mortar track, this M1A2 tank, this M1A2 tank. Artillery would also strike this area. Again, this is the highway moving through right here. It is under the street level. The street is elevated over this highway, and this is a street bridge. The Americans were guarding the street bridge as these forces were on a general advance through the area. Although they lost a vehicle, their armored recovery vehicle, their Type 84 armored recovery vehicle, would move in and pick it up when it was safe to do so, with the rest of the vehicles moving here, returning fire against American forces, including against this Bradley that's moving into the area here. There's a dismounted squad moving up with it in a wedge formation on this side of the houses, behind this fence that's blocking this side of the street from this street right here that ran through these housing neighborhoods right here. This street where the driveways of the houses go into, there's a fence separating this big boulevard type street from this narrow street that ran through the neighborhood. As the American troops that were, or the Chinese PLA troops that were dismounted, were moving up through this neighborhood, they had cleared these homes and were moving through the area. There were 2 half squads here, which made a full squad, 2 half squads here making a full squad, and a full squad and a full squad. As the wedge formation bounded to this fence, These two half squads came together as a full squad and bounded across and held their position along with the wedge formation that stacked along this fence, as did these two half squads that came together and stacked here along the fence and peered around it, while this full squad right here moving along this fence between these homes and this fence separated it from this street moved into the area here. They had begun taking fire from the dismounted troops and Bradley, but they had fired an anti-tank missile, an HJ-08, and destroyed the Bradley while the other troops were firing 35-millimeter tube-fired grenades beneath their rifle barrels, beneath their QBZ-95 rifles, as well as Type 69 anti-personnel rocket-propelled grenade ammunition. While they did that, they laid suppressive fire. This squad moved in, took position behind the garage, and laid down fire. Then they bounded, laid down fire. Then they bounded and laid down fire. They bounded and laid down fire. They kept them pinned down until they had completely wiped them out. And as they did that, at the same time, this squad got over the fence and begun to move behind these homes, coordinating their actions through their radio headsets with these squads of their platoon, and they begun to lay down fire on these American dismounts in a double column formation, who returned fire against these forces, but eventually these forces prevailed and defeated all of them without any wounded or casualties, and they bounded ahead. By the time this squad bounded here and then they bounded here, they continued bounding up here and stopped and held their position while this squad held their position here, while this squad went up and then eventually around this house at the very end to hold their position here. And they were firing and throwing grenades over the fence at these two LMTV trucks that parked on this other side that were at the time guarded by these dismounted squads and Bradley, and destroyed them with grenades, while this squad had been moving, coordinating its action as well, firing at this Max Pro MRAP. And by the time they got to the end of the fence here, they had blasted a hole through this fencing, and they fired an HJ-08 anti-tank missile and destroyed this Max Pro MRAP that had been firing at them but missed them, as they were very careful in their movements and basically had stayed in a obscure area where it would be difficult to see them through the fencing, and they had stayed low in the prone position. They coordinated everything through their ISR assets. They saw the Americans before the Americans even knew they were approaching in this particular area. As the loitering munitions had moved across the highway on their AI target seeking mode and were seeking out targets, they had caused immediately these American forces to leave that were being mortared by 120 millimeter mortars and artillery strikes, as shown here. And these LMTV trucks are completely destroyed by mortar strikes, artillery strikes, and loitering munition strikes, including these two half squads of American troops that were right here on the other side of the street from these two half squads guarding the bridge with the tanks. As the counter-mortar fire landed right here and destroyed this American mortar track, as well as the troops, and these LMTV trucks were destroyed as well. These squads that had cleared this building were moving through the area, bounding and covering tactically, as two squads went inside by the burning, smoking tank that was sitting here. They went inside and cleared this store, while this squad held the outside after this squad had fired an anti-tank missile and destroyed this striker right here. And then they moved into place and held their position here. All the while as that was happening, these vehicles were on the move of this platoon right here, as these vehicles were on the move as well. As so many things were happening on this map, there is a lot of activity on this map. This company was conducting movements as well. However, this company will be explored first. As these remaining vehicles, before the armored recovery vehicle would go and fetch this destroyed armored personnel carrier, the Type 89A, the rest of the vehicles had begun to move alongside one another up the street, while this dismounted squad in a wedge formation had moved up here. Earlier was taking fire as the tank was then destroyed, they mounted up in their infantry fighting vehicle, which was on the very end here, the ZBD-04A, while the other 3 surviving Type 89As continued moving up the street parallel to it until they got here. The squad was dismounted after the mortar strikes and loitering munitions had destroyed these forces, and these forces were destroyed as these forces cleared the store and came out on the other side by this destroyed striker that had been hit by an anti-tank missile, a HJ-08. The squad then was dismounted here, the wedge formation that started here and got in the ZBD-04A and rode within it till it got here. It was then dismounted and moved up again to check this area. And the ZBD-04A had fired an anti-tank missile while it took briefly some fire from the tanks that missed, as it had its laser scrambling as well as IR scrambling capabilities, and the shell missed and it returned fire with an HJ-09 anti-tank missile, which destroyed it before firing its 100mm ammunition at the troops across the highway bridge that were guarding it, as well as 30mm autocannon ammunition, while the heavy machine gunners were firing their heavy machine guns and taking some fire from American forces that were destroyed by the mortars, as well as the heavy machine gun fire and loitering munitions, with no survivors in this area by that point. As all of that was going on at the same time, many movements were occurring over here as well. As these squads went through the process of clearing these stores and this large store here in the gas station area, as these cleared the housing neighborhood and held their positions over here after destroying these American forces, this platoon, who had some losses, they lost 7 troops and even had a few wounded from a lucky 81mm mortar strike, they had continued on with their operation after medics from the headquarters platoon tended to the KIA'd and wounded, with the remaining members of the squad, which essentially was just over half a squad, bounding out here while their heavy machine gunner was laying down fire against these American forces that took cover behind these abutments with grass and trees in them, as it was decorative but also was good for tactical movements and protection. As the fire at the opening of the map was being exchanged rather intensively, loitering munitions moving through the area had struck an M1A2 tank before it was even able to open fire. As another moved into the area, it too was struck by another loitering munition. One had already been badly damaged, and a security formation in a diamond formation was being formed around it by a dismounted American squad, while the armored recovery vehicle was picking it up, as there was an attempt at armored recovery as far as moving the vehicle to a safer location where it could possibly be worked on if there was minimal issues with the vehicle, because the Americans needed all the forces they could get, including vehicle-based forces in the form of their tanks, as the M1A2 was, although it was a highly complicated tank, it was still a very good tank to have, all things considered. As the forces had badly damaged the armor, they had fired their 100mm and 30mm autocannons, keeping the heads down of these forces, while the loitering munition strikes destroyed these 2 tanks here, as there was a Stryker Dragoon vehicle right here opening fire with its 30mm autocannon. Heavy machine gun fire, in turn, was laid down against it. Much of the fire was smacking up against this abutment with the trees and grass in it, but it eventually was being hit by 12.7mm rounds, although some of the very powerful 30mm autocannon rounds had damaged some of the infantry fighting vehicles, although it didn't get very many shots out, and it was eventually destroyed as the PLA infantry fighting vehicle had locked on and fired a 100mm shell, destroying it. The CH-4A armed high-altitude recon drone had fired 2 HJ-10s and 2 CM-502KG dual-purpose missiles across the way at these American forces, as they had an Max Pro MRAP, a fuel truck, and 2 tanks in this particular area, another Max Pro MRAP and another tank, which loitering munitions also flying in the area with the missiles had horribly destroyed all these forces. There was nothing left, along with artillery strikes. There was essentially nothing left across this highway, as the heavy firepower from the high-altitude stealth recon drone, as well as this Wing Loon 2 firing and destroying this entire tank platoon with HJ-10 anti-tank missiles as it flew into the area. This platoon was decimated by the anti-tank missiles fired from the Wing Loon 2. As these CM-502KGs and 2 HJ-10s flew across the way, they also impacted vehicles and destroyed them. While the fire support company had its PLL-05 dual assault gun mortar platoon called up, they were conducting direct fire missions directly into the store. They fired their 120 millimeter shells and impacted this abutment, the Bradley that was behind it with the troops, with 100 millimeter shell fire, and just annihilated this building and the vehicles and troops. There were troops sitting on top of it. They too were KIA'd. The entire thing was decimated by direct fire. They just fired straight into it. They also were firing as in their capacity of a mortar and destroyed this Max Pro MRAP and this mortar track and LMTV truck and troops in a counter mortar battery fire operation where they fired, as this was a 1 mile by 1 kilometer map, north to south, 1 kilometer, and then 1 mile east to west. They were able to fire high up into the air and land on these forces right here, as well as a mortar landing and destroying this LMTV and these troops right here. And heavy mortar fire was called in on this headquarters-like element, as again, these were mixed forces, and they had their fuel vehicles or LMTV supply trucks, as well as command vehicles and MRAPs, all huddling together in this particular area, congregating, as well as supply trucks right here to supply the troops with ammunition and food and fuel. They had fired heavy mortar strikes and destroyed these forces with massive 120 millimeter mortar strikes, as they were adjacent to this access road that ran along the highway here, the 340/6 route, as the Wing Loon 2 combat drone fired its HJ-10 anti-tank missiles and destroyed this entire platoon. The rocket forces of the same company that this platoon of PLL-05 heavy assault gun mortars came from, they were firing their 130 millimeter rockets, which were landing right here as well as off map and hitting various targets as the forces tried to flee, as well as artillery strikes hitting off the map as well, conducting both terrain denial and massive destruction of fleeing American forces. As this company, as all of these actions were going on here, and the direct fire was going on here, as this squad moved behind the assault gun mortars and this squad was laying in the prone, early on at the opening of the map, they had exchanged fire with these American forces, these dismounted squads, 2 squads here, 1 here, 1 here, 1 here. It was a full platoon. They were exchanging fire. They lost a few troops. They lost 2 troops in the exchange of fire. While this squad had moved around the building after dismounting from its armor personnel carrier, they ran behind the assault gun mortars. This squad was in front covering the vehicles and these troops' movement. And then they moved up and lined up and laid down heavy fires. So they fired at these forces. They were firing their rocket-propelled grenades, anti-tank missiles. They were firing their 35 millimeter grenades, throwing hand grenades across the street as far as they could heave them. I mean, it was a massive battle with small arms and heavier arms as well. as the armored personnel carrier here was destroyed by this M1A2 tank as it rolled up before it was destroyed in turn. It was able to fire a shell and destroy this vehicle. So the PLA had lost 2 vehicles and some troops. And the mortar strike earlier was especially devastating on these forces, KIAing, causing a KIAs of 7 troops as well as some WIAs from that platoon right here of this company over here operating there. As these forces here began to dismount their troops early on, their infantry fighting vehicle was firing their 100 millimeter main gun, 30 millimeter autocannon, 7.62 by 54 millimeter coax, and more, as they had rained down destruction with the heavy machine gun fire of each of these Type 89As that flanked their infantry fighting vehicle facing this way. They had fired a heavy barrage of heavy machine gun fire as well as fire from the infantry fighting vehicles of that platoon. So as these forces were assaulting, as this platoon here, along with the fire support platoon of PLL-05s, were assaulting this plaza and all the troops that were in it in this grocery store area, these forces were also being hit by loitering munitions in addition to the 120 millimeter direct fire coming from these forces, as well as mortar-based fire as they could shift to firing as a mortar, as well as the mortar fire in the back and these vehicles being destroyed by the loitering munitions, as well as the infantry fighting vehicles firing their anti-tank missiles and dismounted troops firing theirs. There were a lot of means by which these forces were being annihilated, as this whole plaza would soon be cleared by this platoon moving up here before shifting and moving 3 of its vehicles into the plaza to flank the rest of these forces, such as these hiding behind here and those hiding behind here that were still even alive. As the 5 vehicles moved here, 2 moved up here before dismounting their squads to clear this apartment building, while another group of squads from this platoon here that were dismounted already, 2 half squads right here that were guarding the vehicles, providing mutual infantry vehicle support to one another while after clearing the buildings, while these bounded and covered ahead tactically, rolling T formation going into this building, while this squad held the outside and moved up alongside of it, coordinating their actions via radio with one another as they went through this building, methodically clearing it, while the vehicles of the platoon moved up and went into the apartment complex itself, smashing their way through the gate right here, just breaking on into it. And they were laying down heavy fire against these dismount American troops, as well as this Bradley hiding behind this particular apartment building. There were LMTV trucks for logistical support right here. More dismounted troops in a wedge formation guarding them behind this apartment building right here. There was an armored recovery vehicle pulling a destroyed Striker right there. And there was a Max Pro MRAP guarding the back of this convoy moving up the way. As they were moving out of the area along with this tank platoon, the tank platoon again was destroyed at the opening of this map as these missiles had been fired by the Wing Loong 2 again. While this platoon, at the same time as this platoon, its vehicles and dismounts were moving into this apartment complex, they were moving up this street, and they sent 3 vehicles to outflank the forces that were left, that were hiding behind these abutments that were in this complex right here. I mean, in this grocery store plaza. As they did this, they dismounted one squad that went through the back of these buildings, of these stores, clearing them, as the troops on the roofs had by this point been KIA'd by all the exchanges of fire, as the troops on the roof could be hit actually easier than those that were behind the plants and shrubs and concrete flower boxes, basically what they were, that were abutting the parking lot here. As they used all the cover and concealment they could to their best advantage, the eventual outflanking maneuver by this platoon with the two vehicles guarding the flanks, their two Type 89As, with their infantry fighting vehicle coming in through the middle, dismounting a squad to clear these buildings, while another squad came in from the back and eliminated whoever was still even alive behind this area, as they were in a heavy exchange of fire with this platoon right here. This is the headquarters platoon. They're logistical and command elements of this particular company that was right here, as this was a fire support platoon from the fire support company, a separate element. This was a full company right here of mechanized infantry. And this was the other company of mechanized infantry who were moving up through the housing neighborhood, the apartment block, and stores and gas station. They had moved up and cleared this entire area of enemy forces, as the other company, with the help of the fire support company's forward deployed platoon of PLL-05s, had heavily bombarded this entire grocery store slash shopping center plaza here and behind it, as they had heavily mortared these forces right here. And they had destroyed in counter mortar fire this M113 mortar track with its 81 millimeter mortar, and also these logistical forces right here, these trucks and troops. As they came in from the side, dismounted a squad to clear this building, they, after finishing off these enemies from behind with their help of their mobile fire support platform, which was their armor personnel carrier, with the ISR assets watching for any enemy activity, they began to move out and into the parking lot, outflanking whoever was even still alive of these forces, with heavy support from their infantry fighting vehicle moving up through the parking lot itself, as well as the dismounted squad from it moving up alongside it and holding its position. As they held their position in the middle of the parking lot with their infantry fighting vehicle, this other squad from this armor personnel carrier had cleared these buildings before moving out and holding position right here, with the other two vehicles of the platoon that had moved here dismounting one of their squads that moved through this area, with this vehicle continuing on up here as this squad moved up from this vehicle right here at the green that had exchanged fire briefly with these forces right here and this tank right here before it was destroyed by a loitering munition. These vehicles then moved up, and after a brief exchange of fire with these forces trying to leave the area that were ultimately destroyed by loitering munitions, artillery strikes, and 130 millimeter rocket strikes, they stopped and held their position here with this vehicle that dismounted a squad into this building. They moved up outside the building, held their position after a brief exchange of fire, and then this vehicle moved up into this apartment block right here, stopping briefly while the dismounted squad from it moved alongside it, while this other vehicle that was in the shopping center moved to the back of the plaza and moved alongside this fencing that separated the apartments from the shopping plaza. And as they moved through the back, clearing the back, they stopped and held their position here while the dismounted squad went into this apartment building with their vehicle that they dismounted from, moving up alongside them and into this area that was now cleared from the mortar strikes, and began to clear these buildings, finally moving into this one and holding their position here. As all of that was going on at the same exact time, these forces from this platoon right here, which are these dismounted squads that belong to these vehicles, the infantry fighting vehicle, the ZBDO-4A, and the 4 armor personnel carriers, the Type 89As, these squads now advanced as they moved in and cleared these buildings after wiping out these 2 American troops on the roof of this apartment complex. They had exchanged fire with them. At the opening of this battle map, there was already a heavy exchange of fire from the forces over here as well, as all of these dismounted forces and vehicles have green around them means they're being engaged. As the mortar landed on this side of the building and did not harm any of these troops, the mortar had been taken out by counter-mortar fire, as well as the other mortar being taken out by loitering munitions that was across the highway and up here, this mortar track being taken out by loitering munitions. As these forces then moved through, as this rolling T cleared this building, this squad moved up beside them, coordinating everything via radio, as mentioned before, as this squad moved alongside this building here, and then they moved around here, while this squad left and then bounded across the street while they covered the corners, while these American dismounted squads had bounded and covered themselves, bounding and covering towards the Chinese troops as the vehicles were laying down fire on them as the vehicles moved up from the platoon with their dismounted troops clearing these buildings. As they moved to the side to hold the corner, they bounded across after their vehicles had finished off these forces bounding and covering towards them. They were bounding and covering while this movement was taking place and their vehicle was engaging them. This vehicle had briefly engaged, these vehicles had briefly engaged them and this tank, which had tried to open fire on them but was destroyed by a loitering munition as these forces were moving through this area, beginning to clear these buildings. After this squad bounded across the way while they tactically held the corner for them, this squad right here that's in a line formation but then bounds as a wedge alongside the building and eventually holds its position here. This squad from this other platoon here that had come from these vehicles had dismounted a squad in here. So this squad could bound with this other squad and clear this building, while this squad cleared this building and then moved on to the next one after these troops had already been all KIA'd. Now, they hadn't been KIA'd yet, but as they moved into position, they were now being engaged by the PLA forces as they entered the building and were now fighting two PLA squads within this apartment building, and they had been KIA'd for it. With one squad leaving and going to clear this building, with this other squad from this other platoon clearing this building, while then their vehicles move on ahead. And now that they've gotten here, after these forces had all been destroyed, they're now engaging these forces here. While this squad then leaves this building and goes around the destroyed tank that had been KIA'd by a loitering munition and enters this apartment guard shack, as it's a gated apartment complex, before going out and holding their position here. As these forces had tried to flee, they'd been chased by loitering munitions, including an American squad that ran out of this building, as this squad then had taken position around this building before going in to clear it, causing an American squad to flee and having rocket strikes, artillery strikes, as shown here, as well as more artillery strikes here. And this is all rocket strikes from the fire support company within their own battalion, firing their 130 millimeter rockets into this area. All of it is ISR directed, guided by the quadcopter and also higher altitude reconnaissance assets, including even the CH-4A that made an appearance to fire missiles. As this is a high altitude reconnaissance armed drone, it was helping with the guidance of the rocket fire, sending the information and coordinates back to the FDC of the fire support company, helping to direct the fire of the light artillery rockets, the 130 millimeter multiple launch rocket systems, Type 63s, which landed and decimated these forces with the assistance of loitering munition strikes against the vehicles and artillery strikes against them as well, and against the troops. As this had occurred, this was a large number of combat actions that unfolded throughout the duration of this map. And it's important to understand that everything that occurred on this side of the map here, with these starting at these apartments, clearing these stores after wiping out the personnel on the roof, and also clearing these neighborhoods and fighting enemy personnel in the neighborhoods in the form of two dismounted squads, a Bradley, and then an MRAP on the other side of the fence, as well as two LMTV trucks. as well as a tank moving into the area that managed to destroy a PLA vehicle. There had been a lot of fighting going on, including against this striker right here, and the mortar track being counter mortar fired and destroyed by counter mortar fire from the assault gun mortars. There had been enormous activity having occurred here, with the tanks being taken out by anti-tank missiles from the infantry fighting vehicle and a loitering munition strike from this loitering munition flying right into it at the opening of the map, allowing for the advance, with the CH-4A firing its CM502 KGs and HJ-10 anti-armor weapons at forces on the other side of the highway, with heavy mortar fire, artillery strikes, as indicated by the circles and X's, with the green arrows all encapsulated in red, meaning they've all been destroyed, with the forces already encapsulated in red destroyed at the opening of the map where the mortar strikes are occurring, including these two half squads being KIA'd. These two across the bridge, guarding the bridge right above the highway here, they had been KIA'd as these forces engaged them in a firefight and destroyed them as these vehicles moved up and blocked and took position by the bridge. From this platoon here moving into the area, and also this platoon here moving into the area here, blocking the bridge, guarding this bridge. As American forces fled and the precision artillery, mortar, and light artillery rocket strikes landed upon them, along with some loitering munitions that remained, these forces were decimated. And this was only the fighting that occurred in the central part of the battle between these mixed American forces all gathering together in this area. This was only 2 companies of the 6 mechanized infantry companies and fire support company and headquarters and support companies that comprised this entire